Okay, so we're going to talk about the common or some of the common architectural styles or design patterns. We start with the repository pattern or style. Here in the repository style, you have the repository that contains all the shared data structures. So the commonly needed data structures will be part of the repository. And the repository will provide interfaces or services to allow access to these data structures. Okay? So other subsystems, all the subsystems that need access to them can use that repository. Here's an example. You can if you are creating a development environment, so you may have some classes that are represent the compiler. Okay. And the compiler's job generally is to generate the parse tree and the symbol table. Now, you may argue that since the parse tree and the symbol table are generated by the compiler, then they should belong to the compiler component. And that would be one design choice. It could be better in some cases, but in other cases, it's been seen or shown that sometimes it's better to put all the shared data structures in a separate subsystems like this, in a separate component. Now, any other subsystem that are part of the whole system, part of the development environment, or that we're talking about, like the debugger, like the editor, may access the parse tree and the symbol table through the repository. Okay. Now, in some cases, it's better to do this separation. In other cases, it's not. So it depends on system from system. It makes you have to make a decision depending on the details of your system. But this is one of the options that you have, and it can be useful in some cases. Another common style or pattern is the MVC or the model view controller. So in that pattern, all the domain knowledge or all the classes that has to do with the business logic are called the models and belong to the model subsystem or the model component. All the classes that has to do with the interface or displaying something or conveying something to the end user are part of the view subsystem. All the classes that has to do with getting input from the user or getting commands from the user would belong to the controller subsystem. Okay, so the view would subscribe to the model. If you remember the subscribe, notify, or the publish subscribe model from a previous course. So whenever the view, any of the classes inside the model is updated, all the views that has subscribed to it will have to be updated as well. Okay. Now the controller initiates that update. Now you see there is the word repository used here. Now also, because these are commonly needed to be accessed data structures, it can be considered some sort of a repository. Okay, but how the controller would make the change is based on, generally speaking, we're talking about a user interface or an application that has a user interface. It would take the command from the user or from another system. Regardless how the command came, there is an initiation of an action. Okay, so the controller initiates an action to modify something in the model, and once there's a modification in the model, the view needs to be reflecting that. Okay, so here's a combination of a high-level design with a low-level design. Now, you learned in the publisher subscriber model. You're talking about the publisher is a class, the subscriber is a class, right? Now, in a high level, it's just all the publishers or the notifiers are belong to the subsystem that we call the model. All the subscribers belong to the subsystem that we call the view. Okay, now here's an example. So let's say the data that we have just represents the file names. And you have the folder view, that's one view, and there's the information view. Okay, now when you try to change the name of the file, so let's say the context menu, for example, that you open in order to change the name of the file, so that the part of the system that takes that change of the name is the controller. Now that part of the system that took the change of the name initiates a change in the model, so the name in the model would change. Therefore, both views, the folder view will change and the information view will change. Okay, now the separation between the controller and the view is a little bit confusing because it's different than the kind of system that we're used to. I'm just going to emphasize that this variation of the model, and then we'll talk about the ones that we are more used to. So here, so this is the variation that we're talking about when the controller and the view are completely separate and they don't interact with each other. So something like this, you have the controller, the components that take the input from the user are separate from the component that actually views the data to the user. So you have the screen. So this is like a temperature controlling unit. You have a screen. This is the view. The screen is the view. And you have the button or the wheel that you use in order to change the temperature. So that component, the component associated to this part that takes the input is what we call the controller. Now the part that just displays the data is what we call the view. So the user would use the controller to manipulate the model. So the temperature itself is the model, that's the data itself. Okay, so the controller would take the input from the user to change the model. And once the model change, every view should change. Okay, and this is particularly useful when we have multiple systems that have multiple user interfaces. Now, here's the one that we actually are used to. This is the variation, another variation of the MVC. And it is the one that we commonly see because in a common application, so common like a web application or a common graphical user interface application, the controller and the view, or the part that takes the input and the part that displays the data are the same. So you have let's say a web form, for example. This web form have some information to display to the user, let's say quantities and prices. Okay, and also have some aspects or some components or some controls that take the input from the user. So the controller and the view are not completely separate as the other variation of the model, but you can make it a little bit better design if you just use the controls in the web form or the user interface form to take the data from the user, but the logic that handles this input, the logic that handles these commands, you just separate it in a different class that we call the controller. Okay, so they are not completely separate. They kind of interact with each other. So the view still, it still displays something to the user, but also takes input from the user. And it just takes that input and send it to the controller. All the logic that handles the input should be separated into the controller. So now if you have an application that have a web interface and an Android interface and an iOS interface. Now, if you can separate the logic that handles the user input, you reduce the amount of code that you need to duplicate in order to create the multiple interfaces of that same application. Okay, so that is the model view controller pattern.